The pandemic and its economic fallout will have a severe impact on the state budget. By one estimate, revenue could be down by $6 billion with 5 years needed to recover lost ground. In response, some economists and policy groups say the best option for recovery is to raise the income tax and minimize the harmful effects of austerity. To make that case are a senior policy analyst at Mass Budget and Policy Center, Phineas Baxandall, and associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and Department of Economics, and the associate director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University, Alicia Sasser Modestino. Thank you very much for being with us. I want to start with Phineas because almost everything that we're covering in the news these days is in the shadow of this national divide, whether it's racial or economic. We know whether it's the pandemic or the protests. How does that affect the budget narrative going forward right now?
Thank you, Chris. It's a great question. I mean, if you think of our budget as kind of what we can do together as a community, how we bring our resources together and invest them in the things that we do as a community, it really matters what that budget looks like for what kind of disparities and what kind of inequalities we have. So if we are disinvesting in things that are important to some communities and we are investing more or taxing less for other people, that really affects the kinds of inequalities we have, and it affects our ability to invest in communities, and that that is related to the kind of big differences that you can see between different kind of racial communities that compounds things when it gets mixed with issues about police brutality.
Turn to Alicia Sasser Modestino. If you were to try to tell people how big a problem we have with the budget, I mentioned a big number, but that doesn't tell you a whole lot. How bad is it right now?
Yeah, it's pretty bad here and across a number of states. And that $6 billion figure that you cited at the beginning, that's a decline of about 20% from where expected revenues were. That's a huge chunk of the budget. And the thing is that it's not going to just be this year, right? So we know that, for example, Main Street recovers much more slowly than Wall Street. And so we know that the labor market effects of this are going to be persistent. We know that reopening is agonizingly slow, I think, at this point for businesses, for individuals. And so the revenue that the government will be able to collect over the next 1, 2 to 5 years is consistently going to be below expectations of where it was before the pandemic. And, to the point earlier that this budget conversation is really important right now because it's really putting in stark terms the short term versus the long term, right? So in the short term, we're going to have these really large budget deficits that we're going to have to face. We might get some federal aid, we might be able to use the rainy day fund, but it's not going to be enough to plug this hole entirely. We're going to be left with the choice of making some really painful spending cuts or potentially increasing revenue in some way, shape, or form, such as the income tax. And that has really important implications for different communities in and around Greater Boston and the Commonwealth. And in particular, for communities of color, if we take the short-term view of severe spending cuts, that's cuts to K through 12 education reforms that we were going to put in. That's cuts to police and fire and other health and safety infrastructure, to local aid for cities and towns. That's cuts to the safety net in terms of what we can provide in terms of unemployment insurance and Medicaid above and beyond what the federal government provides, food pantries, all the things that these communities are really relying on now. And so, taking the very short-term view is going to have really important disparities and racial implications, and that should be part of the conversation.
Phineas, tell us a little more about that, because even if we're not worried about any kind of divisions around the country, given the crisis that we've been through, aren't there going to be all these other demands on the safety net that we didn't have a few months ago?
Well, yes. I mean, every time, it's one of the kind of cruel thing about recessions at the state level. Unlike the federal government, which can, during recessions, kind of borrow more money. The state has to balance its budget, as do cities and towns. And so at the very same time that you've got more needs, more people who are homeless, more people who are hungry, more people who need unemployment benefits, things of that sort, that very same time, you have less revenue coming in to pay for it. So sort of your needs are greatest when your ability to pay for them are the least. So that's the bad news. I think the good news from the point of view, and this is really came up in this conversation with these economists who signed this great letter, is that whether, we sometimes talk in conversations about whether people, should we care more about economic growth or should we care more about, sort of social concerns or inequality? And the kind of good news here is that for both those concerns point in the same direction. I think more obviously, if you care about social concerns and inequality, you invest in that. But what's interesting here is that during a recession at a time like this, the more you are making up this budget gap by cutting, the worse it is for economic growth as well. And that's a little perhaps counterintuitive for people, but the reason it's true is because the money, every dollar that is coming from a tax increase, neither of those things are good for economic growth. But the money that comes from a tax increase, some of that money might have been invested in other states, some of it might have gone into some trust fund, some of it goes into other savings. It doesn't all sort of multiply and recirculate through the economy. On the other hand, the money which gets taken out of the economy by a state budget cut, money that gets saved by furloughing teachers, by stopping a contract for fixing a road, something like that. All of that money was money which was going to be circulating, consumed within the state, multiplying the state economy. So they're both bad choices that you don't want for economic growth, but it seems like the choice that we are faced with. And the good news is that they both point clearly to these new revenues, like we've done in other recessions, to look for new revenues to make up these budget cuts. We've sometimes done it more with budget cuts, sometimes more with revenues, but to the extent that we're doing it with new revenues, it's going to be better and faster for economic growth and recovery.
Thank you, Alicia Sasser Modestino. Of course, I'm sure you're aware there are groups out there who also are saying, we don't want a tax increase. We have all these people in these households who are hurting economically. How dare you raise any kind of tax on them? What do you say when you hear that?
Sure. Well, we're not talking about raising the income tax across the board without thinking about families that are hurting right now, right? So in the letter and in the proposal, what we're suggesting is, along with a 1% increase in the income tax, there are things that you can do to make it more progressive so that it doesn't fall on those who are hurting the most right now. So for example, we can increase the personal deduction, right, to make sure that low-income families are going to be not taxed as heavily in this increase, or even held harmless depending on where their income is. We could also exempt unemployment insurance benefits from the state tax. Right now, actually a lot of the collections that are up right now in terms of state taxes is from the withholding that's coming from unemployment insurance benefits, right? We could give that money back to people and make sure that it's exempted from this increase in the state income tax. So while it is true that raising income taxes sounds very counterintuitive, it's something that under normal circumstances would scrub off growth and probably be counterproductive. During a recession, we're really left with the choice between the lesser of two evils, I guess is what I would say, right? And so the deep spending cuts that we're talking about, again, are direct cuts that we know will slow growth during a time when we really need to be increasing spending, right? We need to be priming the pump with more spending. And the thing is, when you give those transfer payments through the safety net to a low-income family, they spend it right away. Their marginal propensity to consume, so that means their willingness to spend that last dollar, is really, really high because they need it, right? They will spend it on food, they will spend it on housing, they will spend it on those essential services. On the other hand, when you think about cutting taxes, when you do that, not all households spend that money. Some households save it. And we've even seen already during this recession that households are naturally doing what you would do during recession. You tighten your belt, right? You save some of that money because you're worried about your job down the road. And so by ensuring that we are increasing public spending, or at least maintaining public spending, that means that we're going to be priming the pump. We're going to be making sure that we're maintaining consumer spending through these safety net programs, through our investments in K through 12 education, which right now, ironically, is something that we will desperately need when children return to school in September, given the learning loss that we've already seen. So even though it sounds counterintuitive, it sounds harsh, obviously this can be structured in a way so that the income tax can be increase could be more progressive. It could fall more on those higher income households like me who have been sitting from home and working and they're maintaining their employment. And that small shared pain on those who are still earning a living above a certain threshold will help make sure that those at the bottom are getting the services that they desperately need right now.
Phineas, I imagine sales tax revenue is down, but there has been this tremendous growth in online retail. Should tax policy adapt to that in some way?
Well, a lot of the retail online is now taxed through the sales tax. And one of the things about the sales tax is that it is a regressive tax. That is, as a portion of people's income, it is a larger portion of people's income. Even though people who are wealthier spend more, it's a smaller part of their income for the same thing that Alicia was talking about, because they don't spend their whole income. Others of it is getting saved or put elsewhere. So sales taxes probably are not a good place to look for this. Sort of the more progressive a kind of tax is, the better it's going to be both for our inequalities and for pumping up our economy again. So in the Economist letter, it talks about the income tax, the personal income tax in the greatest detail, and that is one of our largest taxes. But there's other things such as taxes on corporate profits are in some ways very adequate, very appropriate for a moment like now, because if you are a company which is struggling and not making profits, well, good news, you have zero profit subject to tax. If you are a company like Amazon that is making bucket loads of money right now, then you've got more money which would be subject to that higher tax rate.